Ender's Shadow by Orson Scott Card. In many ways, this is the most direct sequel to Ender's Game, because the action takes place concurrently with that novel, simply following a different point of view in this book. If you're new to my channel, I'm taking this year to reread the 10 books in the two series called Ender's Quintet and the Shadow series, before reading The Last Shadow in December. Last Shadow was just recently published by Orson Scott Card and is the culmination of both of these series. So I'm rereading these books one per month in what's kind of more chronological order in the world rather than the way that they were published. So last month I did my review of Ender's Game, which is one of my favorite works in the science fiction genre of all time. And I was very excited to read Ender's Shadow because when I originally read both of these series, I actually enjoyed the Shadow series a little bit more. So what follows is a spoiler-free review of Ender's Shadow, but I do want to talk about a couple points of spoiler talk. So I will save all of that till the end, and when I get to that point, I'll give you a little timestamp that you can skip that and just go to my wrap-up to see what I think most about this book in comparison to Ender's Game and what I'll be planning to read next month. So with all of my individual book reviews, I like to discuss what it's about, breaking down plot, character, setting, and then talk about the themes. So I will do that, but some of them are really tied together, so it's not going to be a section on plot, a section on character, a section on setting, because some of the character points might be plot points and might be setting points as well. So a lot of this will be mixed together along with theme as well. So let's start with what's it about. So Ender's Shadow follows Bean. Bean was a character in Ender's Game, and he was one of Ender's lieutenants. So where we had in Ender's Game, we had a point of view from Ender. It was his story, and about 80% of that story followed him, his point of view. This follows Bean. And although there is a little bit more fleshing out of some secondary characters, this is Bean's tale, just like Ender's Game was Ender's tale. So a lot of the plot points are the same. We're in a world that had been attacked by an alien species. It is our Earth, I should mention that. And we were attacked by a species known as the Formics, which they call the Buggers. And 80 years have passed since the Buggers last attacked. And in that time, mankind, in the form of its international fleet, has been trying to find that next great military leader. That was the only way that Earth was able to survive the attack by a species that was more advanced. They were outmanned, they were outgunned, and the only way they were able to win that battle and to stave off that invasion was because of a brilliant military commander. So the international fleet is looking for the next great military commander to command the fleet for that third invasion, which they know is going to happen. As a result, they start recruiting children, very young, trying to find the most precocious, the most intelligent, the kids with the highest IQs that they can mold into the perfect military commander. So they have to find somebody that's very smart and has the right temperament to take on this task. So the first book, Ender's Game, was about Ender in this recruitment process, and this one is about Bean. Bean's backstory is in many ways more compelling than Ender's because Bean's story is a bit harsh. When we first meet Bean, he's 3 or 4 years old, and he's starving and homeless and living on the streets of Rotterdam. So he has a much more harsh backstory than what Ender had. Although Ender didn't come from the most loving home, he did come from a stable home with parents and siblings. And Bean is a street urchin, just trying to find something to eat once a month. And it's a kind of a harsh setting, and Card doesn't stray away from it. You really start to feel a lot of empathy for this character early on because he is so young and he doesn't eat and he's starving and he's just trying to survive the older kids that he just calls the bullies. And we see a lot of parallels with the bullies in this book as we did in Ender's Game as well. So we see Bean early on. He is called Bean because he was smaller than his age. He's about 4 years old, but he looks like he's about 2 years old. But he has the intellect of an adult. And this precociousness pervades the text all the way through. And it's a very interesting aspect of Bean's character. It makes him feel a lot older because mentally, intellectually, he is a lot older than everybody around him. So the story follows Bean just like Ender's Game followed Ender. It follows Bean from his days on the streets, how he gets out of that setting, onto IF school and beyond. And the book, in many ways, starts and ends exactly where Ender's Game does. Now, one thing I have to say, because I saw something online that frankly was wrong, do not read this book first. Read Ender's Game first. There are 3 major plot turns in Ender's Game that are frankly ruined by reading it here. But reading it here second, it makes a lot more sense, and it makes you reevaluate some of the things in Ender's Game. But if you read this first, it would ruin, frankly, one of the most enjoyable moments in Ender's Game when you realize some of these plot turns. So if you're here in the spoiler-free section and this sounds like a great book, make sure you read Ender's Game first. This is a great book. That's a great book. Both of them are certainly worth your time. So Bean is a very precocious character and very smart, but he did border for me, especially in the first half of the book, in that Mary Sue type of character that can do no wrong. And at times I didn't like him because of this. It seemed like a lot of times he got out of trouble and things like that a little too easy, and it was just explained away as, oh, well, he's just really smart, so this thing that he did solved the problem that he was in. And it was, again, a little Mary Sue-ish for me until he started to evaluate himself a little bit. And the first step of evaluation that I really liked with this character, that made me connect more with this character, I felt a lot of empathy for him, but I didn't connect with him initially. About halfway through the book, he's talking with one of his fellow classmates in IF school, and this classmate, Nikolai, who is really one of his only friends in the platoon, comes up with an idea that Bean hadn't considered. And Bean was almost shocked because he knew he was the smartest person. How did he not consider this? To which Nikolai, of course, replies, "You're not the only genius here, Bean." And I love that moment because it knocked Bean down a little bit. It knocked him off of that Mary Sue perch, and it made him start to evaluate and to consider that even though, yes, he knew that he is the smartest person in this school, Ender included, the adults in the story included, he knows he's the smartest, but he's not infallible. And that's when I started to connect with this character a bit more, because I felt that he was starting to grow. At the heart of this it's a coming-of-age tale, just like Ender's Game was. Ender's Shadow is Bean's coming-of-age tale, from a precocious street urchin to this perhaps great military commander in the future. And we see his growth, but it was that single moment of growth that I really, really connected with this character. There's a second moment of growth that I don't want to bring out until the spoiler section that made me just truly connect with this character. So those of you that have read this, you can talk about that. We'll talk about that in the spoiler talk. If you haven't read it and you read it, just come back and get there and we'll talk about it, because that point for me really helped me connect with this character. So there are a few more other characters in this that are fleshed out pretty well, but don't have huge prominent roles. But the one part that I did like is I did feel we got more insight into the adults in the tale in this one than in Ender's Game. Much like Ender's Game, at the beginning of every chapter, we had an epigraph, which was a conversation between some of the adults in the story. And I felt that some of these were longer, had a little bit more depth, and just gave us further insight into what mostly these military commanders were doing to these children in flight school. And, you know, some of them were Colonel Graff from the first book, but then we had DMAC, we had Major Anderson, and then we had Sister Carlotta, who's another character that I'll touch upon. But I felt that it helped, I guess, make the story a little bit bigger. Both of these stories are very self-contained, because we have 70 to 80% one point of view. You're in that character's head. Most of the action takes place on a space station where they're, you know, training with their platoons. So a lot of times these epigraphs with these conversations with these secondary characters in many ways just simply helped you inform more of what was going on in the world. So before I talk about Sister Carlotta, there is one other character in here that, especially early in the book, is a really important one, and that is the character Achilles, which is actually pronounced Achilles because they're in Rotterdam. And Achilles is, in many ways, Bean's version of Peter. So Ender had Peter, his older brother, who was kind of sadistic, borderline sociopath. And that's kind of what Achilles is. Achilles is an older boy who, through certain actions that I won't give away for spoiler reasons, becomes part of this crew of younger kids of which Bean is part of. And Achilles, although a very interesting character, is in many ways kind of that nemesis of Bean, because Bean kind of sees straight through what he is and thinks that a lot of what he's seeing with Achilles is an act, and he is a rather bad person. And he learns on a little bit more about Achilles. But the one thing about Achilles, even though he's primarily just in the beginning of the book, much like Peter in Ender's Game, he pervades the text quite a bit. Just the things that he thinks about, that Bean thinks about in regards to Achilles, you know, informs a lot of his character as well. So he is an important character, secondary character that's not just present a lot. But Sister Carlotta is a really interesting character to me. Sister Carlotta is the character that helps Bean get into International Fleet School. She essentially helps out at what is equivalent to a soup kitchen, and it's for children. And she starts to see Bean at this soup kitchen and gets to talk with him and starts to realize that this very tiny child is not only older than he looks, but extremely intelligent. And she thinks that because of this intelligence, he may be a valuable asset to join the IF fleet. And their interactions are very interesting. I found Bean's distrust for her very real, because he was someone who had to trust nobody to survive on the streets. And you just see the sister just certainly trying to do everything that she can for Bean. And when she finally does get him into flight school, which is not a spoiler because that's very, very early in the book, we start to see that she still cares for Bean, because she starts to search for his parents. And she tries to find out where he came from, thinking that this extremely high IQ, this genius of a kid, couldn't have been just the product of two homeless people on the streets that had a baby and gave it up. So we see Sister Carlotta quite a bit, even if Bean doesn't see her. And in many ways, she fulfills the same role that Valentine did in Ender's Game, as Ender's, you know, person that loved him and supported him on Earth. That's what Bean has, even if he doesn't directly know that firsthand. The other thing I liked about Sister Carlotta is that she informed a lot of the world building. One thing I'm always fascinated by when I encounter a science fiction tale that's set in Earth in the future is, what does the author think will happen with religion? Will it be a case that the religions are pretty much the same as today? Will they be lesser? Will they be more? Will they be totally gone? Will it be like a Star Trek utopian society where, you know, humankind has moved on from religion? Well, we see with Sister Carlotta, first of all, Sister Carlotta is a nun, so we know that Christianity has certainly survived through the decades or centuries. We don't know what year this is set. So we see that that has survived. But also when we see her actions on Earth, she helps us see more of the bigger, not only religious things going on in the Earth, but the political factions. So she is a very important component of helping us see more of this world, which I really enjoy, even though I do like the self-contained small tales that these are, both of these books are. I do like in this book how we learn more about what the state of the Earth is. Because having read the rest of this series, I know that a lot of that is going to be more important. So Card starts to flesh that out, and I just found it very interesting the way that he approached this. So if that's something that's interesting for you, I think you'll enjoy that aspect of the story. So let's talk about some of the themes. I already discussed that this is, above all, a coming-of-age tale. This is Bean from age 3 or 4 all the way up to, you know, somewhere in his teens. And it's a great, highly compelling coming-of-age tale. If I didn't mention when I mentioned the plot, I think in many ways Bean's backstory is more compelling than Ender's because of the strife, because of the hardship, because of what he had to endure. And it does help you connect with him initially. Even if I disconnected a little bit with him because of the Mary Sue nature of some of the plot points, a result of his intellect, I eventually just loved this character by the end, especially as it got on further into the book and you see some of his growth, where you find out he's not just a smart kid. So I really enjoyed that. Many of the themes that I talked about in my Ender's Game review are still present in this book. And I'm not going to rehash those. I think I gave a pretty good overview of my thoughts of those thematic points in that review. So if you want to check that out, they're not necessarily at the forefront of this novel, but they are certainly in the subtext. They are certainly back there, and there are a couple that do get rehashed, especially for the reader by the end. One of which I'll talk about in the spoiler section, but because I can't ruin it here. But one point I do want to bring up that I think just Card does so well in this, and that's just the thematic discussions on leadership. Some of Card's insights into leadership are nothing short of remarkable. Ender's Game is a book that is handed out at military academies for military training and leadership purposes, but I think this one is equally important. The last third of this book, some of Card's insights into what constitutes leadership is nothing short of remarkable. He really knows what he's talking about here. In fact, there were times I was reading this book, and I've read books on leadership. I felt that there were sometimes more insights in this book than some of the nonfiction works of leadership that I've ever read. Truly insightful. It made me remember, I don't remember, one of Brandon Sanderson's books. You know, young writers, they get blurbs by famous authors on their covers to help sell the books. I know Stephen King does that a lot for younger writers when he reads something that they enjoy, that's usually from their publishing company, of course. They'll get a little blurb that'll go on there. And I recall very distinctly one of Orson Scott Card's blurbs on Brandon Sanderson's book was about how Sanderson has great insight into what leadership is. And the reason that Card recognized that is because Card is, frankly, in this book, among the best that I've seen. There's one aspect I'll talk about in that in the spoiler section, but that itself is worth the price of admission. There was so much in there. I want to go through this book more slowly and take some notes, because I don't do that when I'm reading a book for enjoyment. But I feel that there are a lot of things regarding leadership that I can learn from this book. And if I can read a work of science fiction that entertains me and I can learn, talk about a home run of a book. All right, I want to move on into my spoiler talk. So I will put a timestamp up here. Those of you that don't want spoilers, you can skip ahead, see my wrap up. You've heard me gush about this book, so you can see if I think this is better than Ender's Game, because when I originally read these two series, I like the Shadow series better than the Ender series. So skip to that timestamp. You can see my wrap up and what is next month's read in this series. All right, spoilers in 3, 2, 1, 0. Into the spoiler section. So not as much to talk about here, but I want to rehash one of the themes that I talked about in my Ender's Game review. Notably, the idea that the collective is more important than the individual. And it was an idea that I struggled with in that book, where I thought the collective is more important. When you're trying to protect the lives of billions of people, destroying a couple hundred lives, although harsh, is probably okay. And then I changed my mind. If you remember that video, I changed my mind when I realized that we were attacking the buggers. We weren't preparing for defense. And I thought because of that, it changed my mind. Well, this one flipped me back. So Bean is more precocious than Ender, and he's smarter than Ender, and he's smarter than everybody else in the room. And he figures out that we are the third invasion. He figures that out because, again, Earth is a three-dimensional world. To truly defend an entire globe is impossible. don't have the manpower, don't have the forces to be able to do that. And even if you deploy forces all the way around the globe and you get an attack from here, by the time all the forces get there, it's too late. We've already lost the invasion, because you can't predict in three-dimensional space where an attack will come from. So the only way to defend Earth is to attack the Formic homeworld. So immediately I thought I had my idea, that thematic device, totally clear in my head, and then this changed it. Because truly, they were being defensive by attacking. And that alone, man, if that were the only theme that happened in this book, without even the leadership, another one, just mind-blowing, just so thought-provoking. Very, very thought-provoking. So I talked about Bean and how he was a bit of a Mary Sue. And I mentioned the moment with Nikolai where it kind of opened his eyes, where he was no longer fallible. Sorry, he was fallible, he was no longer infallible. The other moment that I really loved with Bean, and that I started to have him, you know, as a great character that I loved, is when he finally gets over the fact that Ender is a better commander than him. He knows he's smarter than Ender, but people don't love him. And he doesn't understand why. He realizes that he is a brilliant strategist, better than Ender, but Ender is a better commander. And I loved his self-realization of this. Because then, that's when he started to examine what leadership is. And that's where, in this book for me, Card really shined. So that part was brilliant. The plot turns that Bean figures out were also just equally brilliant. And what I liked about him figuring out those plot turns is the fact that instead of, through most of the book, you know, Card basically told us that Bean was smarter than Ender. In figuring these things out, he showed us that Bean is smarter than Ender. He figured out that we were the third invasion. He kind of figured out that Mazer Rackham might be alive. He was confirmed all of this when they got to the command, you know, the little moon, and were dealing with old ships. Realized the only reason they were dealing with old ships is because they were launched a long time ago before these new ships existed. So he was showing us that Bean was smarter than Ender. And I like that, because for so long it was just, oh, Bean is the new Ender, he's the new Ender, he's smarter than everybody. But he didn't always show us why he was smarter. All that we got was Bean's own head telling us that he was smarter. So showing those moments for me is one reason I really enjoyed Bean as a character. Oh, and one other point, I almost forgot this one, is Bean figured out that the attack was imminent. Ender kind of knew that they were pushing him along because they thought he was the new, going to be that brilliant commander. But Bean noticed they were doing that with everybody. So that was another point where Card showed us that Bean was smarter, not just told us that Bean was smarter. So one minor criticism from a plot standpoint is the return of Achilles later in the book. I didn't really feel that was necessary, although I did love the way that Bean got him to wash out of the program. I really feel that it wasn't really needed. So that was one plot point that, you know, I just kind of thought could have been cut entirely from the narrative. This was a bigger book than Ender's Game. Might have been a little more closely plotted if that hadn't been there. I also loved at the end of the book, I talked about in the spoiler-free section how Sister Carlotta informed a lot of our worldview with her point of view chapters as well as the epigraphs. I enjoyed when Bean was on the ship and he had access to all this knowledge, started studying Earth because he determined that, yes, Ender was the great space commander, but he's going to be the great political commander on Earth after all of this goes down and we defeat the buggers. So I enjoyed that aspect of it as well. So the big question, how does this stack up to Ender's Game? It's not as good as Ender's Game, but very few works in this genre are. But it is certainly a worthy companion novel. Easy 5 out of 5 for me, and probably if I had to rank all the things I've read in science fiction, it's probably my third favorite book after Dune and Ender's Game. So this is a really fantastic read. I love the leadership. I love the storyline. I loved seeing the story from a different perspective. And I can't wait to keep going with this series next month. So next month's book is Shadow of the Hedgeman, which is the second book in the Bean Ender's Shadow series. So I'm looking forward to reading that. The next 4 months we will be in the Shadow series before we dip back into the Ender Saga. So if you want to see that review, I will be posting that the last week of April. So for that and more, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Goodreads for more content. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.